Hey, monster. You've gone live. Okay.
Oh, hey, look, there he is. Oh, that was my time. All right, I'm clicking off. Right, so I guess I'll get started. So my name is Dylan Mead. I'm in Eugene, Oregon. I am debating on, what was it? Faith is toxic to the pursuit of truth. Okay, so let's go ahead and dig right into that. The history of human knowledge is littered with the corpses of the things that we were all very sure were true, right? So Aristotelian physics, Kepler's Platonic solids, Newtonian physics, polytheism, Euclid's fifth postulate. These were all things that, you know, relatively smart people were fairly certain, and even beyond fairly certain, had a complete faith in, that were true, that ended up, we ended up coming to the conclusion that those things were not true, right? And when that happened, it was because people were able to find some skepticism in those facts and look at the bigger picture, step outside the box, and sort of rethink what they thought to be true, okay? And that's what allowed them to dig a little deeper, search a little farther, and come to new, more accurate conclusions. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Eli.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. First of all, thank you so much for putting this out there and for accepting my debate. I think it's a really interesting topic. I thought the topic was in and of itself sort of very broad. I mean, we're talking about the pursuit of truth. A lot of people will conclude that that might be scientific evidence, because we hear this debate a lot. We hear about faith versus science. Can the two coexist? And my contention is that faith is not toxic to the pursuit of truth. So exactly what your argument is, that's going to be. I'm interested to see how you spell that out. I really truly am. But Carl Sagan, whom in the science community, everyone loves Carl Sagan. I love Carl Sagan. I love science. He says science is not only compatible with spirituality, it is a profound source of spirituality. So, look, is that a proof? No, that's just Carl Sagan speaking his heart. But what you said about science and about what truth has changed. They thought the world was flat. I mean, you addressed this, but forever that was scientifically true, and we know now that that's not true. There's a fringe group out there that do believe the Earth is still flat. I've seen their stuff on social media, but by and large, obviously that has been scientifically disproven. But at one point was true. And so truth can change. Scientific truth can change. And I think that faith by itself is, since it's not since it's not a pursuit of science, truth is different when you're talking about faith versus science. Now, one could say, okay, what's true is true, what's false is false, and I understand that argument. But when someone believes or knows God to exist, then that is something that's sort of irrefutable. Science can't prove it, but science can't disprove it. So that's sort of my opening line there, is that faith isn't necessarily toxic to the pursuit of truth. In fact, I would contend, and I'll talk on this here in a minute, how the two are very compatible and actually complement one another. I am someone who's Christian, but I also am a believer in science. I think the two are compatible, and I think that they marry well together.
Thank you, Eli. So, as you mentioned, it is a broad topic, and honestly, when I first posed the topic, I was thinking of faith in terms of the broader sense, meaning an absolute belief in someone or something, not in the narrower sense, and not with the intent of being condescending, but just that the belief in God with a capital G would be a subset of the unflinching belief in something, right? So that is one thing out of many, many things that somebody could have an absolute belief in. So although I certainly have some opinions about the belief in God or gods, I consider myself an atheist. Maybe just there's a little sliver of agnosticism in there, and that's related to Bertrand Russell's teapot, which maybe I'll expand on later. But that was not necessarily the focus that I was shooting for, and I learned fairly quickly that the language I was using was a little bit touchy, just because many people consider faith to be specific to belief in the Judeo-Christian God. And deism, like you'd mentioned, deism is not inconsistent with science, right? So there's certainly the possibility that we live within a universe that was created by some, conscious motive force that set everything up, and have maybe prehistorically has come down and done things, right, within our observable universe, right? We may never know, but I feel like that's really beside the point. Like, if a flying spaghetti monster descends from the sky tomorrow, I'll be like, okay, I didn't see that coming, but sure, right? And looking at known history, and to have some trust in history. Obviously, history is written by the winners, of course, but it's not all just complete fabrication. Look at the evidence in historical record. I just don't really see any evidence for that sort of thing happening. And you'd mentioned truth as being. I got the impression that you were defining as truth that exists within the human mind, okay, within the mind of a conscious being. Now, I don't necessarily see truth that way, and it reminds me of in the novel 1984, when the protagonist of the story, Winston, is in the Ministry of Love, and he's being reformed by the agent O'Brien. O'Brien is trying to convince Winston that truth only exists in human minds, okay? And that if you believe I'm floating around this room, and I believe I'm floating around this room, and no one else is around to refute that, then in fact, in truth, I am floating around this room. Now, that's not my personal definition of truth. I just don't see it that way. I believe that there's some objective reality that exists outside the minds of humans, or even beyond humans, dogs, cats, dolphins, potential alien life, whatever. I'm talking about truth being a fact of our observable universe. You mentioned that having faith is because it's depending on what your faith is, it could potentially be not inconsistent with scientific pursuits, right? And actually, the whole reason I posed this was because of a couple incidents that had happened recently. One of which was that a friend of mine posted some quote on Facebook that was basically Kurt Cobain predicting Donald Trump's election as president. And I found it pretty difficult to believe. And I said, what? If Courtney Love or I'm spacing the drummer, the Foo Fighters dude, comes out and says, you know what, I remember him saying that. I'd be like, okay. And again, I find it incredibly difficult to believe, but if someone wants to come forward with some reasonable evidence suggesting that to be true, sure. The issue was that my friend basically, fell back and say that his Christian faith has led him to a place where he doesn't need evidence. He's going to just take what people say and take them on their word, and that's good enough for him. And it got me thinking, if having this type of mindset puts people in a place where they basically believe anything they're told, I don't really think that that's healthy. And I'm going to go ahead and pass.
Thank you. Well, I think that your friend who is Christian and who is making a declaration that he doesn't require scientific evidence, that's fine. He speaks for himself. He doesn't obviously represent the Christian community. But do I need do I as a Christian, and again, I can only speak for myself, do I need scientific evidence that God exists? I don't. I have a different kind of evidence, which transcends science necessarily. I've received personal truth, but it's also truth that I can't deny, because I would feel like I was going against the grain, going against what it would be the same for me to denounce that the sun rises every morning. It would be the same thing if I were to say that I don't believe in God. That's hard. I can't explain that with science. That you can't quantify faith, which is why there's like this oil and water tendency in this discourse of faith or faith and science. But when you realize that truth can be universal, you and I expect the sun to rise tomorrow. There's scientific evidence to suggest that it will rise tomorrow. We just don't know for sure that it will rise tomorrow. And you also touched upon the flying spaghetti monster, and there are a lot of people that in a satirical way, I suppose, believe in this flying spaghetti monster. It's just an analogy for God, a higher, some kind of higher being, a supreme being of some kind. There was which reminded me a little bit of Einstein, who, believe it or not, Einstein was a religious person. I don't know, there aren't any accounts of that I know of when I was looking of like his level of devoutness, but he definitely was someone who believed in God, and he never said at any point in full context that science refutes God and that God refutes science, but he did have lots of good things to say about the combination of both. And again, we're talking specifically about science here. Obviously, the debate is about truth, and you've gone past science. You've talked about science, but you've also talked about truth. So that I will give you that. But I know that a lot of people want to see that dichotomy of faith and science. But stepping back away from science and just talking about truth, as a religious person, my faith drives me to pursue truth. I don't blindly believe in God or Christ. I believe that I am required to search what I would call scriptures, which I would call inspired writings, to ponder myself. A lot of times I'll go when I'm alone in nature. Maybe I'll hit my knees and I'll say a prayer. Does that help me feel close to God? Sometimes, yes, it does. And to me, that's a pursuit of truth, because I am always chasing this idea to know that God is factual. Now, on a spiritual level, I know He exists. So I want to make sure that there's not a delineation between my spiritual knowledge of Him and the scientific knowledge of Him. They are different, but they're both true. Again, this is hard. We're getting philosophical. It's hard to go that deep and sort of explain it in a way that's palatable. But an interesting quote by Einstein, which I really liked. He says, everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which we with our modest powers must feel humble. So even in science, Albert Einstein sensed a greater power above it all, a greater purpose above it all. Now, this is a guy who's a metaphysicist, astrophysicist, whatever. We would call him many things today if he were alive today. Quantum physicist, but he had those. He understood that faith isn't necessarily toxic to pursuing truth, pursuing science. He understood that there was a very workable relationship, and all because, and there are a number. I mean, Galileo was a huge contributor to science. Marie Curie. These were people that believed in God, and so they understood, again, as well, the marriage that can exist between faith and the pursuit of truth.
So, belief. If I believe that Gargamel, and in case anyone listening didn't watch the Smurfs cartoon as a kid, like I did, Gargamel was the antagonist in the Smurfs. He was a nasty wizard who was always trying to get the Smurfs. Okay, so if I want to go out in the woods and sit down under a beautiful tree out here in Eugene, Oregon, and get rained on and really feel the power of Gargamel, and maybe Gargamel lives in the center of Mars. That's my prerogative, okay? And it comes back to that. I feel when we're talking about things that are beyond the ability to prove, not just with current technologies, but essentially exist beyond the reach of our physical universe, there's no proving or disproving that. And, you could have a belief that, maybe Gargamel lives in the multiverse and he wants me to kill myself, okay? So that, ultimately will become toxic to my ability to pursue truth because maybe I go and kill myself. But that's really beside the point. Like, what I'm talking about is belief in things that are hypothetically verifiable. Okay, we could wait. I can't cite a study right now, but from what I understand, a lot of Christians believe that Jesus will come in their lifetime, and there's been 1,600 years of Christians who were let down by that. Okay, so that's taking that metaphysical belief and then having it translate into an opinion about the physical universe that ultimately ends up being wrong. Okay, so in that sense, having neither provable or disprovable metaphysical beliefs ultimately translates into just being wrong about facts regarding the physical universe. And I concede the point that great scientific minds, Newton, maybe Einstein, I'm not familiar with that, Kepler especially. Kepler believed that the solar system was basically the planets existing on platonic solids, which were these three-dimensional objects like dodecahedrons, and he believed that as a result of his faith that God had created an ordered and intelligible universe. Ultimately, it was pushing those ideas aside that allowed people to use their powers of observation and really start asking questions like, let's throw away what we think we know and get rid of some assumptions, and maybe we'll learn something new. A good example of this is non-Euclidean geometry. So for roughly a couple thousand years, Euclid's fifth postulate, which deals with the definition of parallel lines, a lot of people tried to prove it. Okay, they tried to prove it with the previous four postulates for hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay, now eventually what happened was some people said, what if we just throw it out? What if we just throw out Euclid's fifth postulate? We do not assume that parallel lines will never meet. And then what implications would that have for geometry? And what they discovered was that there were geometries where parallel defined by the sum of interior lines intersecting another line, what if they actually can eventually meet? So imagine longitudinal lines on a globe, right? So you have longitudinal lines at the equator. There's two 90-degree angles. Eventually they do meet at the North Pole, right? So this brought us to having greater understanding of different kinds of geometry, like elliptical geometry and hyperbolic geometry, which then our boy Einstein applied to his theories of special relativity, and then discovered general relativity, which essentially suggests that time-space is three space dimensions, one time dimension in a hyperbolic geometry. Now, we know this to be more accurate than Newtonian physics, which a lot of people had faith in before. I mean, Newtonian physics, you go out and test it, you launch a pumpkin with your catapult, you crunch the numbers, the pumpkin hits the target. Cool, Newtonian physics works. It is right, it is correct, I believe it to be true. But when you get rid of those assumptions and you ask yourself, what if what we think isn't true? Then you open yourself up to the possibility of learning things that nobody would have ever imagined. Okay, GPS would not work without general relativity, right? So even general relativity and quantum mechanics, because they're not consistent with each other, we know that although verifiably accurate to very, very tight degrees of precision, are not in fact true, right? And what I'm saying is that we need to get away from believing in these absolute truths about the physical universe, and it will certainly help us if we get away from believing absolute truths about the metaphysical universe, just in terms of our mindset. I hate to make a kind of slippery slope argument, but I've seen it in action. I've seen people who use their faith in metaphysical truths as an analogy for faith in physical truths, and then use that to explain why they don't need evidence, why they'll just believe what they're told. And that ultimately is, my gripe with faith. Well, I think I've made my gripe in faith in physical truths pretty clear, in that the history of science is littered with falsities, right? We think things are true, they turn out to not be true. They turn out to be kind of true, that's a good approximation, but not totally true. And beyond that, believing that these metaphysical things are true, spaghetti monster, we're made out of clay, whatever. I mean, there's so many different mythologies around the world that can bleed over into our mindset when examining physical truths.
So what you're saying about just the different laws of science evolving, changing over time, realizing that maybe they don't have every bit of evidence. Maybe if they explore this route, that they enter into a whole new world of mathematics or physics. That's all stuff that I would consider contained within science. Now, science obviously is evolving, changing itself, getting better, realizing that they're short on this and that it should have been this way all along. And so I sort of see that as the general world of science correcting and self-correcting itself. Now, in the metaphysical, there are glaring questions that science cannot answer. Scientists can't even agree on really what gravity is. They have a general idea of what it is, but with mass and whatnot. But there is no general consensus about gravity. There's still some debate there of what gravity is. What is consciousness? Science can talk about neurons and biological sciences where they can try to explain the firing of neurons and new neural pathways in the brain being created in the embryo. So they can try to explain what it might be or what might happen that causes someone to feel self-aware. But science cannot prove what consciousness is. You could call these metaphysical questions, but they've been important to humanity from the beginning. We have account after account after account of humanity trying to find answers to these. Why can't they? I'm not saying it's the fault of science, and I'm not even saying that science will never find that answer. It very well might, but they haven't yet. But faith is leading people to use science to find out what it is. And that is why faith isn't toxic to the pursuit of truth. It's their faith that's driving them to ask these big questions, these age-old questions of who are we? Where did we come from? Where do we go when we die? And so the greatest way for most people to feel good about those, or to fill a void in their minds about those questions, is to use science. And science has done wonders for answering some of the big questions. It just hasn't answered all of them yet. So that's a very general, non-specific example of how faith and science have together led to the pursuit of truth in successful ways. I wanted to read something here. There's a scientist. There's a scientist in Oregon who what does he say? So he believes in God, but he co-developed a cold dark matter theory that seeks to explain the formation and structure of the universe. The fact that he believes in God, it says that may strike some people as peculiar. After all, in some corners, popular belief renders science and religion incompatible. Yet scientists may be just as likely to believe in God as other people. So all these surveys are saying that scientists are really just as likely to believe in a God as people that are not scientists. So the pursuit of science doesn't necessarily lead people away from faith. The data doesn't show that, at least according to this survey. Interesting quote here. I was going to end with this, but I'm going to say it now. Charles Darwin: "The impossibility of conceiving that this grand and wondrous universe with our conscious selves arose through chance seems to me the chief argument for the existence of God. But whether this is an argument of real value, I have never been able to decide." So he doesn't even know if it's worth making the argument. Maybe he's thinking it's hopeless that one can adequately prove that science and God are compatible. But in my opinion, they don't have to necessarily be perfectly compatible. They can be partially compatible, and still, even if they're partially compatible, that means that faith is not toxic to the pursuit of truth. Passing.
So, yeah, you mentioned that, having faith in these metaphysical beliefs is an impetus for pursuing scientific knowledge. And in that, I don't disagree. You know, without giving a bunch of examples, there's absolutely, it was common, monks, right? So why would monks study science? Okay, they wanted to understand the mind of God. And actually, that particular phrase, to understand the mind of God, I've used it myself as an analogy for understanding the fundamental structure and rules of the universe. And not because I believe in God, just because I think it's a concise analogy that people understand, right? So, you know, not to criticize you for you know, citing quotes from Einstein and other scientists, but I would like to point out that there are a fair amount of scientists who do not necessarily ascribe to you know, belief in a Judeo-Christian God or any God for that matter, that will actually use this kind of language to describe why it is they pursue science. Okay, so you know, you'd mentioned the fact that the universe seems to be so well ordered, and you know, there's certain constants like the charge of an electron, or you know, h bar, whatever. There's certain numbers that are very fine-tuned, that if they were different by just a little bit, we would be looking at an entirely different universe. I don't necessarily see that as a reason why there had to be some kind of creator who went in there and turned the knobs and got it just right. But that simply just is how it is. And if it wasn't that way, we wouldn't be here to think about it, right? So, I mean, it's entirely plausible, possible, who knows, that there's multiple universes existing in parallel or in sequence where these numbers are different and you get completely different laws of physics. It really reminded me of Kirk Cameron's banana argument, right? Like, you look at a banana and it's got the ridges that fit in your fingers, and you know, obviously this thing was thought out well. It's high in protein and it's got lots of, you know, good sugar calories, and a human being can get, you know, 80% of their caloric intake from bananas. So it was clearly designed and produced by some, you know, wise, you know, God benefactor that put bananas on this earth for us. I just don't buy that. It just seems to ignore so much evidence, right? And I'm not suggesting that you buy into that either, but it's that kind of argument, whether you're going to expand it to include, you know, why there's bananas, or, you know, narrow it down to just a few things that can never be proven. It's that type of thinking that gets us in a place where we start to ignore.
Yeah, I was trying to tell you that you're running out of time. I thought that maybe you'd want to like close up with something, but so that's what that was. I just wanted you to take a look at the clock. But you're right. There are people in on the faith side who, in their minds, believe that because of God, because they believe in God, that they have to start trying to disprove science. These people are out there. I don't agree with those people. I don't believe that just because you believe in God, just because you're a Christian or a Hindu or a Muslim, that you have to start disproving, or Jew, I have a Jewish family, you have to start disproving science. It's just, there's no reason to do that. You see it also on the science side. So there are some people that because science has through the scientific theory has proven, or there is evidence suggesting that something is scientific, they will use that to discredit God. I kind of liked what you said about how that doesn't have to happen. I think you touched on that the error is when people do consciously try to remove God from science and try to remove science from God, when that's just not necessary. Both can exist. When you're talking about Gargamel, first of all, I absolutely, I know where I'm born in '82. Gargamel, one of the greatest villains of television history, along with his cat, his evil-looking cat, which I can't remember his name, but I. When you're talking about how he could be in the middle of Mars, it is Azrael. That's exactly what it is. Azrael. No, you're right. Thank you. But you're talking about how he could be in the middle of Mars, and you made this whole scenario, which I thought was really fascinating. But then I realized that you put him in the middle of Mars, but I don't know where God is, and I think it's hard to separate your mind sometimes, and it's hard for me too. You kind of subconsciously just put Gargamel in Mars because you had to put him in a physical space. You had to put him somewhere. But it's hard for someone like me to know exactly where God is, and I don't have any evidence of knowing where he is. The Bible says he's omnipotent. I think that's sometimes taken too literally. I think that he can be, if he wanted to, in a defined space. So I wanted to mention that we don't have to put God in a box, or faith doesn't have to be put into a box. Omnipresent. Okay, thank you. Omnipotent, all-knowing. You're right. So, and then you mentioned the vernacular things, saying things like the mind of God. Or OMG, someone could be an atheist and say OMG. Does that mean they believe in God? No, it's just part of the vernacular. So when a scientist is saying they want to know the mind of God, I know what you mean. They're not saying that they literally want to know the mind of God because they believe in God. That's just part of our vernacular. The electrons, one of your last points about the order of the universe. That is why it's really the order of the universe that, to me, is a testament that there can be an intelligent design behind these things. I'm not saying that shows that there is. I'm saying that it shows that there can be. If it were chaotic, then you're right, we'd have a completely different looking universe. And we wouldn't be having this conversation, at least in this format, as the beings we are now. But I think that because things do have order, that you can't just dismiss the fact that there is no intelligent design. Believing in something larger than ourselves, believing in a God, believing in a supreme being, intelligent design, these are not incompatible with science. Faith, which I would put all those things under the category of faith, isn't toxic to the pursuit of truth, isn't toxic to the pursuit of scientific theory. They are complementary. I am, like I said, the reason I took this debate was because I believe in science. I believe that science can prove things. I'm a believer and a fan of the scientific method. I'm also a believer and a fan of God. And so because I believe in both, because I believe one testifies to the other equally, that's why I took this debate. Because in my mind, faith is the opposite of toxic to the pursuit of truth. And I agree with Carl Sagan. I agree with Charles Darwin. I agree with Albert Einstein. Let me just close with this. Albert Einstein, quote, "We should take care not to make the intellect our God. It has, of course, powerful muscles, but no personality." So science can be cold and lonely sometimes, but think of how exciting it is when you're doing science, especially for Christian scientists. who believe in God, when you have scientific breakthroughs and you also believe in God, there's an aha moment on both ends. And so that's my contention. Faith not toxic to the pursuit of truth. And I appreciate you taking this debate. Thanks to QallOut, thanks to Yaz.